All right, we're gonna go ahead and do a sewing sample now. And this is so that you can learn how to sew straight lines. And in order to sew straight lines, you need to follow your stitch plate. The stitch plate has lines on it, and those lines help you to sew a straight line. And we're gonna do what's called a seam allowance. And a seam allowance is the distance between where you sew and the edge of your fabric. So I have a little diagram of the stitch plate that I've drawn right here. This is your presser foot. And we always usually use the lines to the right of your presser foot. There are also lines on the left side, but we're gonna follow the lines on the right because when you put your fabric in the machine, you'll put the edge of your fabric on one of these lines and the majority of your fabric will hang to the left of your machine. That's because you want your fabric to hang where there's space right here and not trying to squeeze all your fabric right here in this little tiny hole of the sewing machine. So the very first line is on the edge of the presser foot. So if I were to put my fabric in my machine and line the edge of my fabric up on the edge of the presser foot, it would be exactly 1/4 of an inch. That means the distance between my needle, which is in the center of your presser foot, to the edge of your presser foot is exactly 1/4 of an inch if you use a ruler. Then from there, every line goes up by 1/8 of an inch. So this next line over that has a 10 on it is your 3/8 inch line. So my seam allowance, the distance between the edge of my fabric and my needle, would be exactly 3/8 of an inch. The next line over is 1/2 an inch. So if I put the edge of my fabric on that line, distance of my needle would be 1/2 an inch. The next line over is 5/8 of an inch. This line that has a 20 on it would be 3/4 of an inch. And this very last line, which is the edge of your stitch plate, is 1 inch. So as you sew, if I were sewing, say a 5/8 inch seam allowance, I would line my fabric up so that the edge is on that line, and as I sew, I keep the edge of my fabric as it moves through the machine on that line, and then that is what will give you a straight seam as you sew. So before you start, you want to make sure your machine is threaded correctly. And one way to check that is make sure it's through the take-up lever, or you will get giant knots when you sew on the bottom of your fabric. Also, pull your threads, and if they move easily, then you're good to go. If you pull on them and something is not moving, then you would want to check each thread. So start with the top. If the top's moving, you know you're good. Then do the bottom, and if that wasn't the one, if that was the one that wasn't moving, then you would pull it out and rethread that part. Or if it was the top not moving, pull that out and redo it. So you want to make sure your threads move easily. Okay, so for your sewing sample, you're going to get a little square fabric that looks like this. And first you're going to write your name with a pen or a pencil right in the middle of your fabric. And there's 4 lines that I'm going to have you do, 4 seam allowances for this sewing sample. So the first one is 1/4 of an inch. So you're going to label one side with 1/4 of an inch. Turn your fabric and label the next one with 1/2 of an inch. Turn your fabric and label the next side with 5/8 of an inch. And your last side you're going to label with 1 inch. So the first one we're going to do is our 1/4 inch seam allowance. So you lift your presser foot up and you're going to slide your fabric in, and we're going to make sure our fabric, the edge of our presser foot, is right on the edge of our fabric. So they meet together. Now always hold your 2 threads in the back when you start, because if you don't, a lot of times they will get pulled in and make a big knot. So always hold them. And we're going to do what's called a back stitch. Every time you start sewing, you have to do a back stitch. So I'm going to hold these threads. I'm going to go forward about 3 stitches. 1, 2, 3. And then I'm going to stop and hold in my reverse button. And I'm going to stitch up to the top of my fabric, because you want to make sure you're sewing from the very edge to edge of your fabric. You don't want to leave a space. And now I can go ahead and let go of these threads. And I'm going to hold my fabric down here. Don't hold it up here. And as I sew, the fabric pulls through by itself. You're just going to gently guide it to keep it right on the edge of your presser foot. Do not watch your needle as you sew. Instead, you're watching kind of the fabric as a whole and making sure it stays on the edge of your presser foot. Remember to go at a moderate speed. Now we're going to sew pretty much all the way to the bottom. When we get pretty close to the bottom, we're going to hold the reverse button in and do a back stitch again. So we're going to go backwards a couple stitches and then forward a couple stitches. 1, 2, 3, and then forward a couple. 1, 2, 3. And then that's it, you're done. To get it out, you're going to lift up your presser foot, pull on it, and create a tail of thread. There's a thread cutter right here. You're going to bring your fabric over your thread and pull down, and it will cut your threads for you. Now if I were to take a ruler, it would be exactly a 1/4 inch seam allowance, measuring from the distance of my thread to the edge of my fabric. Then you need to go back with a pair of scissors and trim your threads when you're finished. So you will always have a tail of threads hanging, and then make sure to put those in the garbage when you're all done. Then just grab your strings and pull them back behind your sewing machine again, and we're ready to do another seam, which would be our 1/2 inch. Now some of your machines have tape on them, and this is if you've never sewn before. This tape can really help you because these lines are kind of hard to see. So what you can do is you can find your 1/2 inch, and if you look back on my paper, the 1/2 inch is this one right here, so it's just to the left of my 5/8. 5/8 is written on my machine, so I'm going to go to the one to the left of it. So you can take this piece of tape and stick it on the line that you're going to follow, and then this way it makes it a little bit easier to follow that piece of tape because it's darker than it is the other. So you're going to do the same thing. Slide your fabric in, put your presser foot down, make sure you're close to the top, hold your threads. We're going to go forward a few stitches, 1, 2, 3, hold in our reverse button, go back up to the top, and now we're going to sew it all the way down to the bottom. Now if you ever got off on this line, I'm going to purposely go off. Notice how I'm starting to go crooked. If you do that, you would not stop and lift and move it over, because then you would technically have a hole. So it's just like if you're driving. If you start to go outside the lines, you just gently steer the steering wheel back into the line. So I'm just going to take my fabric and just slide it back until the edge of this fabric is right along the edge of my tape. I'm going to sew all the way to the bottom, and then I have to do a back stitch. So I'm going to go backward a couple and forward a couple, and then stop, lift my foot, pull my fabric, cut my thread, and I now have 1/2. Now you'll notice where I went a little crooked and then I came back onto where I needed to go. So I'm going to trim my threads. Now look at what my back stitches look like. They're not very big. I have some kids who do big, giant back stitches. They should only be about this big. Now let's say you forgot to back stitch. So this is what you would do. We're going to go ahead and do our 5/8 inch. Stick it right here. Our 5/8 line. And I'm going to put my fabric in, put my presser foot down, hold my threads, and I'm going to start sewing. And if you get this far, oh no, I forgot to back stitch. Don't back stitch now. You don't want a back stitch that's this long. So I'm just going to keep going until I get to the end. Keeping my fabric on my edge there. So when I get close to the end, I'm going to hold my reverse button in, go backward a few, forward a few, lift and pull it out, trim my thread, and then I'm going to go back. You'll notice how the thread's already coming out because I didn't backstitch. So I'm going to come back, use my needle, and put it right on top of where I was before. And then I'm going to hold my threads and I'm going to go forward a couple and backward a couple, forward, and that's it, and then pull it out. So you can just go back right on top and do a little back stitch if you forgot to do that. Now the very last one is just your 1 inch. So you can take your tape, put it over to your 1 inch line if you want. If you don't want your tape, you can just put it right over here. If you don't have any tape, you can come and see me and I can get some for you. So the 1 inch is going to be all the way over here. And again, you put your presser foot down, hold your threads, so forward a couple and backward a couple. Now, if your machine starts, this is what it should sound like. If you hear any type of a clanking noise or a harsh noise, you need to stop because something is wrong and you need to rethread your sewing machine. 99% of the time, when something goes wrong, it's because of threading. Also, do not hold your fabric. You want to let it just pull itself through the sewing machine. You just barely guide it to get it through. And first. Wow. All right, when you're finished, you will need to trim all of your threads, and we will use a ruler to make sure that you have done the correct seam allowances, and then you can turn this in when you're finished.